Welcome to Storytelling. This week's guest is a passionate advocate for survivor-centred, survivor-led care. With over 15 years of experience in the charity sector, she is committed to raising vital funding and awareness, amplifying silenced voices and challenging stigma and shame. As Philanthropy Manager at Global Survivors Fund, an international organisation supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, she plays a key role in helping people rebuild their lives with dignity. Joining us to share her journey, her mission, and to tell us more about the powerful work of Global Survivors Fund, please welcome Katie Tipple. Hello, Katie, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you ever so much for having me, Debbie.
Katie, can you tell us more about the Global Survivors Fund?
Absolutely. The Global Survivors Fund was formed really from a call from survivors of conflict-related sexual violence globally, because governments and duty bearers were not taking the responsibility that they're legally obliged to. And survivors globally have just been silenced. And so Dr. Dennis Mukwege and Nadia Murad, who both won Nobel Peace Prizes in 2018, I believe, heard this call from survivors and got together to create Global Survivors Fund. And the heart of Global Survivors Fund are survivors. So what that means is meaningful repair for survivors. So asking survivors, what does repair mean to you? And creating support that is survivor-centered and survivor-led. And we found that when survivors are at the heart of their own recovery, not only do they get to rebuild their lives in dignity as they deserve, but also impacts the community. So it has a huge impact also in terms of global stigma when we listen to survivors and what they need.
Katie, can you give us an example just so that the audience are more familiar with the type of survivors that you support?
Absolutely. So we are supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So that could be in an ongoing conflict. For example, we're supporting survivors currently in Ukraine and DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, or post-conflict. And I can give you an example. I can give you many examples, but unfortunately, this does include women, men, girls, and boys. This is not just a women's issue. It really is a global issue. And I recently returned from Nigeria, where I got to meet with survivors who endured what can only be described as, frankly, sexual torture for years through an organization, terrorist organization, Boko Haram. And we got to meet with survivors who are, through meaningful support and care, are rebuilding their lives. And this includes mostly women, but some men, but stigma is such an issue for men as well as women, but especially for men in that Muslim culture, and also children, young girls. So it does impact millions of people globally, and we are working hard to raise awareness so that governments take responsibility and actually support survivors in their own countries to rebuild their lives.
And you're not just supporting the survivors, but you're also supporting the families of those survivors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And for example, having met some of the children recently in northeastern Nigeria, they are gaining support through trauma-informed education. So this is essential, especially for young girls who've had education robbed from them, to rebuild their lives. And one way of ensuring that in a very tangible way, because often children are needed to work for the family income, but one way we're ensuring that is by supporting the family with some financial support so that they can send their child to school, for example. Other ways it's supporting families is that we've seen that when a survivor is given the support they need. So, for example, a mother, I heard a story about a mother who managed to escape. And when she did escape, she had 2 children born of rape with her. And at first, unfortunately, and this happens to many, many people in these situations, and it's obviously different in each context. However, stigma is a real issue in these communities. And when she returned to her family, to her community, she was actually shunned away because people didn't and don't understand that this is not their fault. This is a crime that's happened to them. And this woman was talking about how initially just trying to feed her children was dire, really survival mode in terms of, she described 1 meal a day and giving her children leaves. And I don't say this in any way to shame her, I just say it in a way of acknowledging how hard it was for her to survive with her children. And she was then describing that through being given financial support and the community support and mental health support with her family, she's now able to afford a home. And she described having a home that has doors and windows and a floor and a mattress for her children. It's very tangible and essential. And she's now able to feed her children. And so that's a very direct example of, through supporting her, the mother, the children are directly, their lives are benefiting too. And now she can also send them to school. But more broadly than that as well, we find that as survivors rise, and I say that, and I don't mean to sound cliche or I don't know, but it's true. As survivors rebuild from within, rebuild their lives, and it is rebuilding. We hear survivors say this time and time again because lives are destroyed through this form of violence. As they get back on their feet, we've seen in areas where stigma in the communities is really devastating, actually they regain social status and understanding, acceptance back into their church, for example, acceptance back into their community. And then the ripple effect in terms of stigma, in terms of other survivors seeing that it is safe to come forward, it's safe to speak up, and support is available. It impacts the communities in multiple ways.
Hence the title of our episode, Meaningful Acknowledgement. And why is it so meaningful that survivors are acknowledged within their communities?
It's essential that survivors are acknowledged meaningfully because sexual violence globally is the only crime where victims are blamed. Globally, this is not just an issue in conflict zones. We know this. And with that, when a survivor is shamed and silenced, what needs to happen is it needs to be acknowledged. The crime that's happened to them, that it was not their fault, needs to be meaningfully acknowledged to the survivor so that there's chance to actually begin to repair. And repair is possible. I'm not saying they'll ever be the same and they may never fully recover from what they've endured. However, it does start with acknowledgement. It's essential.
How can we as individuals help those survivors?
We can help survivors in so many ways. And I feel speaking up is the first thing we can do. So first, if we zoom back to ourselves, because it's so easy when we think about Global Survivors Fund, for example, or any international organization, to think that the problem is somehow out there. It doesn't impact us, right? It's on the other side of the world. However, if we zoom back into ourselves and if we get really honest with ourselves quietly and ask about our own stigma, like any judgments we have around sexual violence ourselves, and question where perhaps we've quietly even or vocally even but blamed a survivor for that violence. And I think it begins there because once we start to wriggle those beliefs and become more aware of our own limiting beliefs and actually become more aware that silence, as I've said, is only protecting perpetrators, that actually we need to speak up ourselves, whether we're a survivor or not, we need to stand up for survivors, stand in solidarity. And in doing so and using our own voices, we are showing survivors, A, that it's safe to come forward, but more so, we're also showing perpetrators that the shame actually sits with them. It doesn't sit with the survivors as it has been for so long. It sits with them. So it starts, I believe, with our voices speaking up and also asking a survivor, what does support mean to you? What does repair mean to you? And listen. Like, survivors have voices, but we do need to listen. So it starts there. And then, of course, there's more tangible things. Of course, if people want to support in various ways through supporting a survivor organization financially, but advocacy is very, very important too, to shift the culture around silence.
And I think you rightly said that it firmly sits with the perpetrators. Katie, tell me about your own journey and how you ended up working for Global Survivors Fund.
Oh, thank you, Debbie. Honestly, it was a rough ride. It wasn't easy. I've worked in the charity sector, just to backtrack, for years. However, there were about 2.5 years where I was out of work. And the reason I care about Global Survivors Fund is because I have lived experience. And whilst it's not the same, i.e. not in conflict, for example, I do know what it means to feel how important acknowledgement is, for example, and how important survivor-centered care is, for example. So I was going through a really hard time for about 4 years with this. And I was trying to find work. I was trying anything for about a year. I was looking for PA jobs or nanny jobs, really just trying to get my foot back in the door to earn some money. And nothing was flowing. And it was really getting a bit desperate, if I'm honest. And I started to get this intuition of how I would love to work with an organization supporting survivors. And I always know when these things start to bubble up from within, that quiet whisper that becomes a little louder, I always know that that's not fear. That's something really to be listening to. And so when I saw this job come up for Global Survivors Fund, it was absolute hell yes. Like 100% when I saw the organization, what they're doing, it felt completely in alignment with what I care about, what I want to be doing. I want to be standing up and supporting survivors globally. And I worked so hard to get an interview. And I was so scared. I remember feeling so out of practice. I felt I had a belief that I didn't know anything. I'd forgotten everything. I wasn't good enough. And I knew I needed to ask for help. So I reached out to people in my community, professional community, and said, look, can we please have a chat about fundraising again? Because I can't remember. I feel I can't remember. And some people were just absolute gems, and they gave me time and they helped me remember, basically. And I put in an application and I got an interview, and I was absolutely delighted. Now, just to say, before this piece, someone very close to me, I do remember very close to me at the time, said to me, are you sure you want to go for it? You're probably going to get your hopes let down. And I was really thrown by that because I thought, well, you're right. Who am I kidding? Why would they choose me? But this quiet voice within was like, nah, keep going, keep going. So I got an interview. I had the interview and I didn't get the job. And I was like heart sunk. But because of my passion and care and drive, they opened up another position for me. And that's how my journey with Global Survivors Fund began. And genuinely, it's changed my life. And I think from a personal perspective, one of the greatest forms of repair I've experienced has been working with this organization, because I've heard and learned firsthand that A, I'm not alone, and B, how important, like, I'm not crazy to feel that I want meaningful acknowledgement, and asking survivors, what do you need? And trusting their answer, I now know to be true. Yes, it's essential. So I've learned so much through this journey with them. And honestly, I feel incredibly thankful that I get to be part of the organization still.
It's an amazing journey, an amazing experience and story to share. One of the things that you mentioned was getting over that experience and helping survivors get over the experiences, which takes us into the realm of mental health and mental well-being. How best do we support survivors or friends or family who have lived experience?
Yeah, so on the mental health, mental well-being side, it's essential because survivors have endured often, especially when we're talking about conflict, but I also don't want to minimize anyone's experience, trauma, deep, unimaginable trauma that purposefully shatters people's lives. And it not only destroys bodies, but also the sense of identity, of who we are, sense of beauty, and I say beauty in a way that's not to minimize in a way, the shame and the destruction of that form of violence really shatters our sense of self-worth. And mental health support is obviously utterly essential and meaningful. Again, using that word, mental health care, because different modalities support different people. Now, I put my hand up here and I have to be very transparent. I am not a mental health professional. So this is just from my experience and what I learned through Global Survivors Fund. And so I think it's super important, depending how the survivor is feeling within themselves and what they need, one-to-one psychological care or group therapy is often helpful for some people. But we've also seen, for example, in my recent trip to Nigeria in the Northeast, two forms of mental health care which really struck me and stayed with me. And these women are meeting in safe spaces, that's what they call them, as a group. And number one, the community aspect of that, they are not alone, like physically, tangibly being together and sharing their experiences and gaining one-to-one mental health support as part of that. So there's counselors there and everyone's having sessions. Also part of that, what struck me and surprised me is each session that we attended, it began with song and dance, and actually one of them playing games as well. And I was really surprised by this, but now it makes complete sense to me because that somatic healing in action, right? And it also helps to build trust and build community and connection. And then we landed together in circle and then hearing from survivors, for example. Another way I saw was through education. I've mentioned trauma-informed education. And we went to one of these schools, which is run by Neem Foundation, and it's a beautiful school. It's values-centered and trauma-informed. And there are these girls there who are loving learning, and they have a psychologist there, and they have support there. And the education system is entirely geared around girls that have endured this type of trauma. And so they're actually fast tracking and they're actually doing incredibly well with this sort of support that's tailored for their needs. And so to zoom out, I suppose, more broadly in terms of how we can support loved ones who have endured sexual violence, is recognizing, and this is my personal voice here, recognizing that what they have endured is so hard possibly to articulate and to understand because of all the layers of shame and perhaps self-blame that is not correct, but the mind tends to do that because society does that. And also understanding that support, if we're looking at the UK, again, talking from my own personal experience, support can be hard to find when we're in trauma. And so if someone comes to you and is brave enough to speak up and say that they've endured this, if I may, let them know that you believe them, that it's not their fault, and that you're there to support them. And that there to support them in solidarity, what that means is showing up in action too. So perhaps you could help them find helplines. So, for example, in the UK, there's some brilliant helplines like Rape Crisis, and there's other ones as well. But I'd really recommend Rape Crisis as a starting point.
I think it's really important that we show up for anyone who's been in that situation, even if it's just to be there as a friend and not judge, but just listen. I think that's really important. And as you say, just to be that support, because when you've been through trauma, it's hard to trust people again. And you need someone there who you can trust and who you can walk through the situation with.
You're right.
So, Katie, what's one last thought that you would like to leave with the audience?
Thank you, Debbie. The last thought I would love to leave with the audience is that survivors have a voice. We just need to listen. We need to become more aware of our own stigma and stories we're telling ourselves about sexual violence, and acknowledge what survivors have been through. Listen carefully and ask survivors, what does repair mean to you? What do you need? And again, please listen and support people to gain that support that they deserve and have a right to.
Katie, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for being a guest on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for having me on. I really, really appreciate it.
If you have been affected by some of the issues raised in today's episode, and if you would like further details about Global Survivors Fund, then please follow the links in the show notes.